Critical peace talks concerning the war in Ukraine are underway in Saudi Arabia today. Joining us to talk about that is our White House correspondent, John Decker. John, who is taking part in these peace talks, and what's been the reaction from both the Ukrainian president and the European Union?
The U.S. delegation is being led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Trump's National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. On the Russian side, their delegation is being led by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. There is no seat at the table for these initial talks for a representative from the European Union or from Ukraine. They're obviously disappointed and in some cases angered by that. President Trump has said they will ultimately have a seat at the table to decide their future. And he also indicated that Europe, which has provided tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine over the course of this 3-year-long war, will also have a place at the table.
And President Trump is continuing to defend what he calls his reciprocal tariff policy. How would these tariffs be implemented, and is this the beginning of the trade war, John?
Well, the president has said these reciprocal tariffs would be implemented starting in the next few weeks. He'd like to do this sooner rather than later. And the idea here is if there's a 10% tariff on an American good, there would be reciprocal tariffs of 10% on a country that's applying those tariffs to American goods. That's why he calls them reciprocal. This could indeed be the beginning of a trade war with the U.S. and its trading partners around the world, because these reciprocal tariffs would apply to every American trading partner. Trade wars are typically not good because the importers of those foreign goods, they are the ones that pay the tariffs. They pass those costs typically on to the American consumer.
And finally, John, during an emergency hearing on the President's Day holiday, a federal judge heard arguments on a lawsuit to block Elon Musk and Doge from accessing government systems and firing federal employees. A decision could come as early as today. What would be impacted from the judge's decision?
That opinion could be essentially a temporary restraining order preventing the Department of Government Efficiency and the people that work for Elon Musk from going into these agencies and firing individuals. Or she could allow Doge, as it's known, to continue what it's been doing at various government agencies.
All right. Thank you, John, for joining us this afternoon. And Valley News Live will continue to follow developments out of Washington. Check for updates on your free VNL News app. Now, still ahead here at noon, weekend cooking shouldn't be a chore. Up next, the Mr. Food Test Kitchen has an easy recipe for you to try.